Holla ballers, what's going on? It's Preacher. I hope you're having a great weekend. So, last week we talked about how the Paladin, despite my misgivings and despite almost logical judgment, was coming out way ahead of the other classes I've tried for Warlords of Draenor. Now, most of you are happy with that, especially the guys who currently play Paladins, because I assume you enjoy the idea that you might see some high-level play and high gear, which is something a lot of you have been craving recently, is to see what I do when I'm in full gear. It's been a while since we've done that. That's fine, I get that. But what I also had at the back end, like a mysterious sort of back trend, is like, everyone's supporting him on the video, I'm going to send him an email. And it was from the Paladins as well, which was very cool. So I got like 7 or 8 emails, which is nice because they were nice lengthy ones. And they addressed certain concerns about what people believe is an issue about the Paladin. The first thing is about choosing a class for Warlords of Draenor. So we need to address that as a whole. That's kind of a big, androgynous area that we need to cover in itself. And you're not wrong that we cannot predict what the classes are going to look like, what the DPS meters are going to look like in Warlords of Draenor in any way, for any class. And that's just something you need to bear in mind. It's not a case of, oh, well, I'm fine now. Right? A lot of people have this sort of mentality that I'm fine now, I'm going to be great next expansion, right? Because why would anything change? I wish we would live on that cloud. It just doesn't exist. Unfortunately, every class goes through a bad period at one stage or another. And the beginning of an expansion is usually a big teller. A real big teller of how things are going to change mid-expansion, which is when things kind of level out. The beginning of an expansion is a real chaotic time. Some classes are amazing. Some classes are awful. This is usually reflected on the beta and doesn't get changed anyway, which is always really annoying. I'll give you an example. When I did all the raid testing in the beta for Heart of Fear and Mogasham Vaults, my warrior and the other warriors I was playing with in the guild were way ahead of everybody else, ridiculously so. Basically because Sweeping Strikes was very different then. And we were commenting about how ridiculous this was. But it went unchanged for a very, very long time. A very, very long time. It just didn't get addressed, despite the fact that we were ticketing people. And yes, we do this. Ticket them to say, our damage is absolutely ridiculous. It needs rebalancing, or the other classes need checking. We either need nerfing, or everyone else needs rebalancing. Same for the hunters, because it works both ways. What most guilds want, remember, it's not about you. What guilds want is everybody to be performing the same, so we can now bring the player, not the class. That old chestnut. And also the idea that I want the buffs there. I want to bring the players, yeah, maybe for the class, but I might want a certain buff there. What I don't want to do is have a wasted raid spot because somebody's damage is pathetic. Like the hunters were. Yeah, hunters out there. If you didn't know, very early on in the expansion and in the beta, you were fucking awful. Diabolically bad. And a lot of complaints were flying around based on that from the hunters. So guilds are always actively trying to get classes nerfed and buffed to create a solid balance. That's the dream, is to get everybody about the same, so we can in fact bring the player, not the class. We just slot in whoever's best for this encounter. Not always going to work. Some encounters prefer one class over another. So what that means is everything in Warlords of Draenor is completely unpredictable based on what's happening now. Based on where you are on the damage meters right now means not a goddamn thing, because you don't know. We're having a huge level squish. Don't know how that's going to play out. Proc switches. We're getting so many new secondary stats. Old secondary stats are going away. Transmog's staying, sorry. Reforging being removed. How will that really affect us long term? Don't know. Everything is really up in the air. So you're asking yourselves the obvious question which came in these emails is, how can you choose something for Warlords of Draenor? How can you do that? How can I do that? How can you as the player do that? How do I stay with what I'm playing with if I don't know what it's going to be like? Well, first of all, take solace in the fact that nobody knows where they're going to be. Nobody knows. You're not the only person in this situation. What we can look at, and what I am looking at, and what my journey is to find a class for Warlords of Draenor, is I look at the gameplay of that class. Does it meet certain criteria? And I've said this a few times. Does it tick all the boxes? I'm looking for a gameplay that when I'm actually sat at my keyboard and I'm playing the game that I enjoy. That's something that probably isn't going to change. It was one of the things I addressed in the Paladin video specifically, is the level 100 talents are actually very mediocre. Now, I don't like mediocre talents. I want fun stuff, But what it does tell me is they're reasonably happy with how the Paladin gameplay works. Nothing weird going on there. Things like replacing Templar's Verdict with another spell if you choose to take the talent tells me that they're quite happy not to add more buttons. They're more than comfortable with how the thing plays out. So what I can say, with a good solid feeling, is that the way that class plays now is pretty much how that's going to play in Wars of Draenor. When it comes to the damage meter, there's a real problem in the player base, I think, from a lot of players who may be new to the game or just really want that sense of power, is that you're always looking for the class that is dominating the damage meters. Now, that is a really wrong way of looking at things from my perspective. From the experience perspective, you shouldn't be looking for the class that's going to dominate damage meters. What that leads you to is not the dark side, but it does lead you to flavor of the month re-rolling, being stuck in a situation where, oh, this class, like X class is doing really well, I'm going to switch over to X class. You then start re-gearing, and you never quite achieve what you could have achieved on your previous class. And usually if something is really overpowered and it's just consistently winning, is very quickly it gets nerfed. So what I've seen in the past, I'll give you an example of when it's happened, is during Wrath of the Lich King, I switched to a Feral Druid, then a Guardian as it's known now, because they had extreme amounts of HP. Really crazy amounts of health in comparison to the other tanks, which allowed them to cope with certain encounters far easier than the other tanking classes. So the decision was made, Preacher will switch over to a Guardian Druid. I leveled from 0 to cap in 4 days, pretty remarkable at the time, I've got to say, and then geared up, and by the time I geared up and got ready and got into a raid and started doing these miraculous things that only the Druids were capable of, Blizzard just straight up fucking nerfed them. Huge waste of time, and now my old class, the Warrior, was equally, if not better, than the Druid in these situations. And this is just something that happens to people all the time if you're always looking to re-roll to that number one class that's dominating. It's suddenly Blizzard can just say, hey, you know what? That class was doing too much, so this is now nerfed, and now you're rebalanced. What we are looking for, what we really truly want, is not to be on the bottom. That is vastly different from being the class that dominates, is we don't want to be way at the bottom, which is what we now call the Shadow Priest. The Shadow Priest situation, right? We'll call it the Shadow Priest situation, because that's the situation those guys are in. Is on their best day, on most encounters in the Siege of Orgrimmar, given equal gear levels, they're likely to be medium on their best day. And in some encounters, they're absolutely awful by default, before they even try. It doesn't matter how good you are. And then Blizzard turns around and sets a precedent by saying, you know what, that's okay, because you have strengths elsewhere. Well, from a guild perspective, if you're looking to do decent progress like I am, I can most likely be replaced if I'm just way at the bottom, because the strengths I bring, does that outweigh the fact that we're in early gear, pushing to kill things without farming for too long, and therefore we need solid DPS out of absolutely everybody. It doesn't really outweigh that unless you're bringing something ridiculous to the fight that's absolutely necessary. If Life Grip is mandatory for this fight, perhaps we start looking at bringing more Holies and Discs rather than bringing a Shadow, because quite frankly, class X and Y, Z and fucking ABC, who we can also bring, do way more damage than a Shadow Priest, and the Holy Priest and the Disc Priest, they hold their own in the healing meters. And that's a better solution. You want to be in the middle. As much as you might want to be the guy at the top of the damage meter, what you'll quickly find as you move higher in the ranks is being top of the DPS all the time is a rarity, a real rarity, because it comes down to encounter, an encounter by encounter basis. I often feel that a lot of this kind of discussion, it actually revolves a little bit about 10-man, where you're not really competing against the same class. Got to remember, a lot of people in 25-mans and soon to be Mythic, which will be 20-man, is you're competing against the rest of the world in all encounters, and in a bigger raid environment, you're actually competing with other people of the same class all the time. And therefore, being number one all the time is a rarity. It's not something you really worry about. What you should be worried about is maybe what your DPS looks like on the World of Logs compared to your other classes. And if you are in a 10-man and you're on a fight that suits you and you always win the damage meters, are you competing against people of the same class? If not, you need to check where you are in the World of Logs. That's what's really mattering, because eventually you're just comparing apples to oranges. If you're a DK who always dominates, always dominates, perhaps the rest of your raid isn't that good. You might be dominating poorer players, in which case you're not actually doing that well. Always something to consider. But what we can say is that being in the middle is fine. And that's all I hope for. It really is. That's all I hope for when I choose my class, regardless of what it ends up being. I'm certainly not saying the Paladin is definitely a number one. Got to be checking out the Druid, probably on Monday, actually. I forgot it was Mother's Day tomorrow in the UK, which kind of means I'm obligated to do stuff. But on Monday, I'm probably going to be looking a lot at the Druid and investigating that. But again, it's just the gameplay. Just the gameplay I'm looking at. Druid's balance, getting some reworking. Got to investigate that. Got to see what I feel about that. How might that feel? And then ultimately, once I've narrowed it down, we're going to be jumping into the beta, having a little play around there, see what's going on. Long journey ahead for me. But what I don't want people to be confused by is looking at where they are right now and saying that's going to carry over into the next expansion. Because it doesn't in a lot of cases, right? We look at, say, a Resto Shaman, considered a joke at the beginning of Mists of Pandaria, supremely powerful at the end of Cataclysm, suddenly sucking balls. Same with the Hunters, really good at the end of Cata, pretty shitty at the start of Wars of Draenor. Warriors were the number one. Nobody could out DPS the potential of a DPS warrior at the end of Cataclysm, right? It was the way it was. And then Wars of Draenor came out, and then Warriors were really powerful in the beta, eventually got a little reworking, and a lot of Warriors quit because they suddenly got the hammer on them. Don't base anything. Don't do it. All right, guys? Have a great weekend. I can't wait to talk to you on Monday. See you later. Bye.